Good morning again. Reverend Dr. Rebecca Ann Parker once shared in her lecture, What They Dream to Be Ours to Do, Lessons from the History of Covenant, a story about her cousins that she met after moving to California when she became the president of Star King School for the Ministry. In her story, Reverend Dr. Parker shared, Truth be told, I was feeling proud of myself. Captain of my ship and master of my soul, I had valiantly charted my course to become first a cellist, then a minister, and now an educator. When I got to California, I discovered that I had a passel of distant cousins I had never met. She goes on to say, one of them, her cousin Eldon, was dean of the American Baptist Seminary at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. He proposed a family reunion, so they got together. Rebecca Ann Parker reflects, when we arrived in the driveway of cousin Sally's home, I got the first introduction to my distant cousins by reading the bumper stickers on their cars. One said, if you want peace, work for justice. Another said, teachers do it with class. Another said, live live music is best. And then there was one that said, if you love Jesus, then tithe. Inside a Jello salad, homemade rolls, and tuna casserole, reminiscent of every church potluck, Rebecca Ann Parker reflects she had ever attended. They said hello to one another. Here was Sally, a minister of religious education and graduate of Pacific School of Religion. And here was Mike, a professional French horn player and high school music teacher. And Eldon, a seminary dean, and David, a United Methodist parish minister. Every single one of her distant cousins was a musician or a minister or a teacher, and several were all three. Not only that, the ministers were all liberal social activist types with an intellectual bent, and all the musicians were classical. Reverend Parker reflects at this point in her story, quote, apparently I had never made any choices at all. My life was given to me, I did not make myself. And this is how it is. We receive who we are before we choose who we will become. And this is how it is with covenant as well. We are born into relationship before we shape relationships by our conscious intention. We inherit covenant before we create covenant. Covenant making must begin with the question, what have we been given? What is the covenant we are already in? We inherit covenant before we create covenant. I find the words of Reverend Dr. Rebecca Ann Parker gently staying with me these days as a reminder of things we inherit and the legacies we leave behind. As we reflect on the questions, what have we been given? What is the covenant that we're already in? Another story comes to mind for me. I've already shared with you all last time I was here that my family of 5 migrated to the US in 1998. 10 years later, after helping with working for our family businesses while going to high school and college, as did my brothers, we found out only four of us were given our citizenships. My middle brother was all of a sudden undocumented, given around 60 days to move out of the country, but he stayed to finish his undergrad education. A few months later, he was pulled over while driving, and he was arrested for being undocumented. When my brother was arrested as an undocumented person, he was transferred to a detention center in Youngstown, Ohio, many miles away from us. Once we found out where he was placed, we began to plan regular road trips to Youngstown, going back and forth between Virginia Beach and Ohio as often as we could. On one of our planned trips, my parents and I entered the detention center where my brother was being held. The correctional guards who had normally let my mother into the center wearing open-toed shoes had changed their policies without notification, so she wasn't allowed to go in wearing sandals. On that day, my panicked mother got into her car, immediately drove out of the detention center. She needed closed-toed shoes, but there were no stores to be found. She decided to stop at a gas station where she saw a bunch of people sitting in front of the entrance while I stayed in the car. She explained the situation, and the people began to help by Googling where she could buy shoes. All of a sudden, joining the attempts of others, this tall Black woman stood up, looked down at her shoes, and in a prophetic spirit took them off. She nudged them over to my mom, and my mom took her shoes off and nudged them over to her. Mom then walked back into the car in the shoes of this stranger, half a size too big for her, held onto the steering wheel with trembling hands, and drove back to the detention center to be let in. Reflecting on Reverend Dr. Rebecca Ann Parker's words, we inherit covenant before we create covenant. And her question, what have we been given? I can't help but think this stranger we met in Ohio moved into action, beholding an unspoken covenant that I only hope all of us could live up to when someone in need approaches us. The stranger didn't know our politics. She didn't know what religion we practiced, or if we were atheists. She didn't ask for anything in return. She simply acted on a covenant she inherited and invited us into. A covenant that was full of grace, trust, and understanding. A covenant that held our fears, our brokenness, our tears, and our hopelessness. A covenant that was grounded in transformational love. Who wouldn't want to exist in a world where such a covenant binds us all? This was one of the many covenants I have inherited in my life before creating covenants with new communities and people I've met since then. As you reflect on these stories, please join me for a brief moment of music reflection with a slideshow before part 2 of this sermon. The conversation around covenant making can be playful, tense, messy, joyful, complicated, and all of those things are normal. But it's important when we're thinking about our theme this month, cultivating relationships, to think about how covenant impact those relationships. I find people get stuck on making covenants perfect, or create a covenant where people have to live up to this ideal of perfectionism. And that is not what this is about. It's not about wordsmithing. It's about the deeper promise you are committing to hold yourselves to when things get really hard. It's about deepening the relationships here today with all of you. We're not perfect people. We have scars we carry. We carry joys too, but at the same time, intersecting with that joy can be sorrow, fear, shame, and brokenness. Covenant needs to hold all of the complexity we bring as humans into these spaces. When I think about the ways we hold ourselves accountable to covenant, I think of Kintsugi. I learned Kintsugi when I lived in Tokyo, Japan for 2 years. And the process often made me think of the ways we deal with our own brokenness in life and the ways we mend the mistakes we make. In the prior slideshow, you saw pictures of a broken chalice that was repaired. I recently got to practice Kintsugi with my chalice that I had ordered online. It arrived broken in several places. I decided to use Kintsugi as a meditative practice to reflect on the ways we heal our wounds and renew our promises. As you read in the slideshow, Kintsugi is a Japanese practice of repairing broken pottery in which cracks are filled with gold paint, highlighting the shapes of the cracks with the valuable material. The flowing shape of the flaws adds to the beauty of the piece. The technique was developed accidentally when 15th century shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa broke his favorite tea bowl. He sent it to China to be repaired and was disappointed when it came back stapled together. An author, Andrea Montanavi, tells us local craftsmen came up with a solution. They filled the cracks with a golden lacquer, making the bowl more unique and valuable. The repair elevated the fallen bowl back to its place as Shogun's favorite and prompted a whole new art form. This method transforms the artifact into something new, making it more rare, beautiful, and storied than the original. Another author, Laura Casely, writes in her article, broken plates get a new meaning with Kintsugi, the art of finding beauty in flaws, that behind Kintsugi is a spiritual philosophy, wabi-sabi, or the embracing of imperfection. A much used, well-worn object, for example, is considered beautiful for its history and for how useful it's been. The cracks signify an event in the life of this bowl, the way a scar or a laugh line might signify an event in a person's life. The cracks in a dish are considered something to celebrate, not something to hide. It reminds us that the things we think are flaws, like scars, blemishes, wrinkles, or other signs of our own wear and tear, are actually signs of our unique growth and stories. From Kintsugi, I learned we should all enter into co-creating covenants humbly, knowing we will make mistakes and we will break promises. Think of covenants like a broken chalice and think of the work of repairing the covenant as gluing the pieces back together using intentional practice, knowing you will have to hold still for some time until the pieces stick together and can hold themselves up without support. That's what it's like into entering a conversation after making a mistake and breaking a promise. Leaning into the difficult conversation, moving past the shame and fear that may be hindering us, and perhaps having someone there to help us to enter back into right relationship. We enter into conversation acknowledging the ways we broke the promise and hope to mend the relationship until it is able to hold itself up or together without support. After some time, when the glue dries, and we paint the cracks of the once broken chalice in gold, symbolizing the ways we renewed our promise and the deepening of relationship. Our result is our covenant, our relationships become more rare, beautiful, and storied than the original. As Jalaluddin Rumi, a Muslim philosopher, poet, and saint, once said, the wound is a place where the light enters you. And for me, this means accountability. Accountability is the willingness to practice repairing harm and mistakes, the willingness to engage in the discomfort of knowing a promise was broken, recommitting to the covenant, and knowing that the process of recommitment brings with it healing and light into the wounds that were created for everyone, including the person that caused harm. I leave you with the words of Mia Mingus from her blog post, Dreaming Accountability. She says, what if accountability wasn't scary? Take a deep breath and let that sink in for a second. What if accountability wasn't scary? It will never be easy or comfortable, but what if it wasn't scary? What if our own accountability wasn't something we ran from, but something we ran towards and desired, appreciated, held as sacred? What if we cherished opportunities to take accountability as precious opportunities to practice liberation? Accountability is not a destination. It is a skill we can build and practice. It is an art, a craft, an alchemy we can learn to wield, just as we have learned how to wield hurt and shame and fear. If accountability is a skill we value, then we must make room and make commitments to practice it ourselves each day, each week, each year. We can start small and build up our skills from there. We can start with our everyday relationships and those closest to us, our families, our friends, our partners, our coworkers, the earth. May we enter into covenant by risking vulnerability and courage, and with a willingness to commit to the alchemy and practice of accountability in all our relationships that we cultivate. May we welcome all our brokenness and our wholeness to the ways we engage with each other. May we tenderly hold each other in the complexity, trust each other as we covenant, and allow the covenant that holds us to make us a resilient community. Amen. May it be so.